Welcome to the scientific method. This is where we're going to start our scientific journey as we start on earth science. Obviously, the scientific method applicable to any other science class that you have, as well as really applicable to anything where you're using critical thinking, answering questions, or presenting evidence. So with this, you're going to follow along on your note sheet. The notes are labeled scientific method notes. As you can see, there are places for you to fill in the blanks, and it'll be pretty clear where the information is. However, please don't limit yourself to simply this note sheet. You can take other notes if you wish, add doodles in the margin. Make sure that you are writing down whatever you need in order to understand these concepts, because like I said, this is going to form the foundation of not only this class, but really any other class that you are going to take in the future. So let's get started. First off, our introduction. The main thing about science is that we are always asking questions. We are looking out at the world and we are wondering. From early on, wondering things like, why is the sky blue, to why do quarks move the certain way that they do, and what does that have to do with the rest of the universe? Instead of just looking at the world, you are curious about it. You are asking why. And I'll just give you a life hint here. It does make life a lot more interesting when you are curious about the world. Of course, in order to answer these questions, we need to have a process that's going to give us answers in the right way. So the way that we do this as scientists is use observations and tests. And the way that all of this is ordered, it's in a very logical method, which we stamp the name scientific method on. Right now, if you were to go onto Google and just type in scientific method, you're probably going to see a lot of different ways that people sort of lay out the scientific method. It all follows a pretty basic structure, but some steps may differ between person to person. Also, I'm going to be showing you this in a sort of linear but cyclical way. Just remember, depending on what kind of questions you're asking, which field of science you're in, maybe you're jumping back and forth between steps. But the point is that overall, this is kind of the same way that we have been answering scientific questions for however long we've had science, which is almost forever. So this next part I'm going to show you is a simple breakdown of our scientific method. This is not on your sheet. This might be something you want to add. But this is going to show you kind of the overall what we're looking at. And so, just as I said before, it starts with observation. It starts with looking at something, some sort of, we would call it a scientific phenomena, something happening, something that's there, and appreciating it. Once you see it, you're probably going to have some questions about it. Why does this work this way? What is happening? What happens if I do this? Like I said, being curious is really easy when you're a little kid, and so I'm going to use the example of what people call making potions to kind of explain us through this method. For example, when you're a little kid, you're in the bathtub, the shower, whatever, you notice there's shampoos, there's conditioners, there's bubble baths, there's soap. Maybe you observe that, all right, they all have different levels of soapiness. The bubble bath makes a lot of bubbles, whereas the conditioner, maybe not so many. So, questions you start to have is, what would happen if I started combining some of these substances together? So you might form a question like, what happens if I pour some bubble bath into the shampoo? That's where you're going to get to testing your hypothesis. In this case, it's pretty easy. You're just adding two substances together. Your overall hypothesis, your question is if I'm adding these two things together, something interesting is going to happen. So you do that. You add that shampoo, that bubble bath together, and you're going to get some results. You're going to get some data. You're going to have these observations, these measurements of what happened. In this case, maybe you add the shampoo and the bubble bath together, and it makes some crazy purple concoction that makes bubbles that are bigger than your face. That is data that you're getting, and part of analyzing that data is figuring out how this goes back to your question, how it answers your question. So in this case, it made different colors and giant bubbles. You're answering your question, yes, something will happen if I mix these two things together. Finally, we're going to take what we've learned and kind of put it into context. What does this mean for the world as a whole? What does this mean for you? Well, you as a kid, you realize, hey, mixing stuff together can lead to some very interesting results. Therefore, I think I'm going to keep doing this and seeing what happens if I add conditioner or even more bubble bath or a different kind of soap. A lot of this evaluating results is also communicating your results to other scientists, in this case, other little kids. You go tell your friends on the playground, hey, if I mix this with this, I got some pretty awesome potions happening. From there, maybe they can start their own little scientific journey. And like I said, you have observations from your results, you go right back into that scientific process. Basically, you are observing a phenomenon, you're asking questions about it, you're answering those questions, and usually those answers are going to give you even more things to observe to get even more questions. It's really an awesome, never-ending process, and at least that's why I think science is really fun. Now, we're going to look at steps of the scientific method. In this case, we're going through sort of a little alphabetical thing. So as long as you know how to do your ABCs from O to V, you can kind of remember all these steps. They're going to go into a little bit more detail, but let's take a look here. Starting with O, we've got observation. So like I said, you are looking at a phenomenon. You are looking at something happening, something that exists in the world. In earth science, maybe you're living in a town next to a mountain, and all of a sudden that mountain explodes. That is definitely an observation to make. Now you have a problem to examine. Why did this mountain that I'm living next to explode? What's going on? Oftentimes with observations and problems, there's a lot of them just in one phenomenon. So for example, what's going on? Why is there fire shooting out of this mountain? Where did all the energy come from? Where did the top of the mountain go? In order to narrow things down, that's where we're going to start to narrow down a question. We're going to make a hypothesis or a claim. So you're going to say, there's something about this mountain that I live next to that made it explode and turn it into a volcano. There's something about that, and I'm going to figure it out. Now, another part of this is going to be our research or our background information. This can kind of be woven in with our observations and problems. Science is really great in the fact that you are standing on the shoulders of giants. We are working from discoveries, data analysis that people have made before us, and we are answering further questions, getting deeper knowledge in order to figure stuff out. The point is, you see a phenomenon, you ask a question, maybe somebody's already answered that question or part of it, or you can help narrow down your exact question looking at what other people have looked at before. So maybe when you're doing your research, you find out that mountains come in different shapes. There are mesas that have completely flat tops. There are mountains that have conical cone-shaped tops. And then there's just sort of your regular triangular mountains. So from there, you can go back to the mountain that was next to your house that turned into a volcano, and you can say, hey, I remember it had kind of a conical top. So you can go back, refine your hypothesis, your claim, and you're going to say, I think that mountains with a conical top have more of a chance of turning into a volcano than other shapes of mountains. And that's what you narrowed down with your research. So now you have your question, you've got your research backing it up, so you're going to set up a controlled experiment. Now, usually when I say experiment, at least the first thing that I think of is something more in like chemistry or the biomedical field, and not necessarily earth science. Usually when you think of an experiment, that's something that you are changing a variable in order to see an effect. This is going to be a little different when we look at things like earth science and biology, where instead of changing something, we're kind of looking at differences. So in this case, I've categorized my different mountain types into sort of normal, pointy, flat top mesas and conical shapes. And so when I have these categories, I can kind of compare between them. I'm going to be gathering evidence. But of course, there's also the actual set up an experiment side of this, which we're going to go into a little bit later. So once you have all of that set up, you're going to run your tests, you're going to collect data, and you're going to analyze data. For the analysis, at least in this class, a lot of it, we're going to be looking at graphs. So we're going to be looking at line graphs, scatter plots, and from there figuring out what the information is telling us. Like I said before, you want to have your data answer your question, and you want to figure out how to do that. And a lot of times the question is you are doing it with math. But once again, we're going to look at that even more just as we go through this class in general. So now we're on to U. This is understand, form a conclusion. This was the evaluating results from our last slide. Pretty much you have a question, you've answered the question. Now you want to put it into context. What does this mean? Maybe you figured out that by looking at a bunch of different mountains, their shapes and the histories of those mountains, you found out that yes, indeed, mountains that have a conical shape on top tend to explode into volcanoes more often than the triangular mountains or the flat-topped mesa mountains. So therefore, maybe your conclusion from that is when you're planning on building a town, maybe don't put it next to a conical mountain. There's a good chance that could be a volcano. So that's information that you are interpreting, which is another word we're going to look at, and sort of giving out into the world. Finally, verify. So one thing about science is that whatever test you do, whatever experiment you run, whatever evidence you collect, the way that you do all those things should be repeatable. Another scientist should be able to come in, follow your exact procedures, step by step, and the idea is that every time another person follows your procedures, follows your line of logic, they are getting the same answers that you got. That is going to really solidify your results, make them more true in a way. So if somebody else went out and did a survey of different shaped mountains from, say, a different part of the world, and they found the same conclusion, more conical shaped mountains tend to end up being volcanoes eventually in their history. That is somebody verifying your work. They are replicating your work. This is super important because, especially in things having to do with Earth, with biology, sort of this on-the-ground science, a lot of unpredictable stuff happens. So every once in a while, your results may be a fluke. They may be something that's not representative of the rest of the world in general. So you need to make sure that when you ask your question again, when you run that same experiment, you're getting the same answers. And so that's a very important part of science. So once again, here's just breaking that one cycle into a bunch of different steps following the alphabet. So let's break down some of these steps even further so that we're sure we know what we're talking about here. So starting with observation. Observation, as I keep saying, it's your first step. You are going out into the world, you are looking at things, you are being curious about things. So at the simplest, most basic part of this, observation is the act of observing. But it's also the act of recording scientific phenomena. So you're looking at something and you are making a record of it. Now, what you're making a record of is just the facts. So exactly what is happening. Observations, they're coming into you through your five senses. So you are recording exactly what you see, what you hear, what you smell, what you can feel through your sense of touch, what you can taste. This also extends to what you may be reading off of an instrument. These are exactly what is happening out in the world, out in nature. The way that we can break this down even further is into two types of observations. The first type is quantitative. With quantitative, think quantity, so numbers. Quantitative observations are numeric values. So our examples down there are 5 centimeters, 20 degrees Celsius. And the way that these numbers are consistent and reliable is in the way that 5 centimeters always means 5 centimeters. If you tell another scientist this was 5 centimeters long, they know exactly what you're talking about. Same thing with 20 degrees Celsius. 20 degrees Celsius is the same temperature no matter where you go in the world. So this is a very objective way of making observations. However, if you don't have the instrumentation, or you're looking at something that cannot be measured in this way, the other type of observation you can make is qualitative. So qualitative, think qualities. These are descriptions. So our examples are red, large, sweet, loud. As you can tell, less objective. After all, everybody kind of sees these descriptions in different ways. For example, the color red. The color red in the little temperature guy on top of quantitative, is that the same or different from the color red in the DNA model over there on the right? These things could change, so they are more subjective, however, still very valuable. In a later bit of notes, we're going to talk about when you use a line or a bar graph. And just kind of a preview there, just remember that quantitative data, we're usually going to be using a line graph. Qualitative, we're going to be using a bar graph. So that's just something to start maybe thinking about why we would do that. Like I said, that'll come later. All you need to know now, quantitative, numbers, qualitative are descriptions. So we know how to make these observations. So we have observation. This is information that's coming at us through our five senses, but there's obviously another step to that. As you can see, lots of bubbling happening in the brain there. And that's what we're going to call interpretation. Once you see, hear, smell, feel this information, you're obviously going to have thoughts about that. So past your senses, once it hits your brain, then we're going to be talking about interpretation. This is what you think about it. These are things that may not necessarily be able to be proven, but they are your version of what happens, or translation. They are a rendition. So if we're looking back at our scientific method, we're obviously using observation a lot in the, obviously, observation step. We're using observation to collect data, But interpretation, that's where what we're starting to use when we're analyzing data and when we're understanding or forming a conclusion. Knowing the difference between observation and interpretation is also super important when you are doing your research, your background, or finding your background information, to realize when a source is just an observation and when it's somebody's interpretation of something. That's important to keep in mind because obviously the observation is going to be provable, repeatable, verifiable. The interpretation, not so much. That doesn't mean that interpretation is less valuable. It's valuable in certain cases, but we just want to keep those differences in mind. Now let's get into our controlled experiments, kind of break this down. So like I said, in a controlled experiment, before you even get there, you want to make sure that you are narrowing down the question that you want to ask. And what you really want to do is get this down to one variable, one thing that's different against quote unquote normal conditions. So in our volcano example, you have decided that normal quote unquote mountains are either flat top mountains or triangular ones, whereas the different mountains are the conical mountains. That's kind of your one variable that you're not necessarily changing, but you're choosing to kind of take a closer look at. Of course, in more traditional experiments, what you change could be something that you are adding. For example, in a medical trial, you have groups of patients who all have the same condition or disease, and you're giving certain patients a new kind of drug to see if they have a different outcome. So that's where you get back to your problem, is what you're going to answer. And your hypothesis is that very, very specific question that you're answering. Notice that hypotheses are written if and then. In the next slide, we're going to look at independent and dependent variables. That's what IV and DV stand for. But what this is saying here with the if and then structure is, if I change one thing, then I expect certain results. In the medical example, if I give patients my new medicine, then I expect them to have better outcomes. Something like that. If I examine all the mountain shapes, then I expect that the conical mountains are more likely to be volcanoes. Anything like that. So let's break down those two variables. Like I said, the independent variable and dependent variable. A really kind of easy trap to fall into is to say the dependent variable is dependent on the independent variable. And it is sort of, but it's a lot, there's a bigger difference there that you really need to know. So our independent variable, like I kind of went into before, this is what's being changed. So we're going to look at this, we're just going to use the example of kind of a more straightforward experiment. This is something that you are doing yourself, you are controlling it. So in my example, this is a chemical that you are adding to something. Our dependent variable is what is being measured. The dependent variable is going to be the numbers, the descriptions you're getting as your results. So what exactly are you looking at? In my example here, I'm adding a chemical to plants. What I'm going to measure about those plants is how tall they grow. The only thing that I'm changing is whether or not I'm adding chemicals, and the thing that I'm looking at is how tall the plants are going to grow. So that's my independent variable and my dependent variable. So let's kind of stick this into our experimental design here. First thing that's going to happen is I'm going to have two different groups. Now I know on your worksheet, experimental group comes first and then control, but I'm going to talk about it the other way around. So I want to start with the control group. Now this is the group that's under normal conditions because you need something to compare to. Basically, if I say, if I add this chemical to a plant, then the plant will grow tall. That's a nice claim to make, but it doesn't have any real world validity because if I just stick some seeds in the ground and grow plants normally, the plants will also grow tall. So what I need is something to compare to, something that's under these normal conditions, so that I can say, if I add this chemical to plants, the plants will grow taller than they would have if they were growing normally. So that's where your control group comes in. You need just normal conditions to compare to your experimental group, and that's the one that's being changed. So in this case, our control group are plants just growing normally, how they would. The experimental group, those plants are being given that miracle chemical that might make them grow taller. Now, an important part to consider here between your control and experimental groups is that you only want one variable to change between them. If we think about plants and we think about growing, there's lots of things that can affect the growth of a plant. For example, the amount of water you give them, the type of soil that they're in, the amount of sunlight they have, the type of plants that they are. That's all going to determine how tall a plant grows. Those are all variables that we want to control for. We want to make sure that those variables are not adding to our results. So that's where we have constants. These are conditions that are going to remain the same in between the control and the experimental group. The only thing you want to change between the control and the experimental group is that one variable that you're changing. So in this case, the only thing I want to have different between the two groups is that my experimental group is getting a chemical and the control group is not, which means that I'm using all the same species of plant. They're all in the same kind of soil. They're all in the same amount of soil. They're all getting the same amount of sunlight every day. They're all getting the same amount of water every day. That way, when I get to my results, I can say it was that one variable, it was adding that chemical that changed the results from my experimental and control group. So we're going to go through more practices of this throughout the week to hopefully kind of narrow down some of these concepts. As you practice this, you're going to be able to start picking out these different parts of our experimental design a lot better. But the point is, at the end of all of this, we're going to get scientific theories and scientific laws. One thing about the theories, scientific theories and laws, is that especially the word theory, we're going to use a bit differently than we use the word theory out in the world. Out in the world, you say, I have a theory, you're usually having more of a hypothesis, more of a question or a guess. I have a theory that the moon is actually made of cheese, that sort of thing. But in a science concept, when we say theory, this is actually a concept that is made up of many hypotheses that have been tested over and over and over again. They have lots and lots of evidence behind them, and we know that they're pretty much true. So, for example, evolution. We know that that happened, we know how it works, and we have many, many years of science and testing and observation and evidence and experimentation to thank for that. Though the thing about science and theories is that they are open to new information. And that's one of the great things about science is we could get new information and a theory could change. For example, if we're talking evolution, Darwin first came up with evolution and he didn't know anything necessarily about genetics. Now we have awesome genetic testing. We can look down to the different base pairs in an animal's or plant's DNA codes and compare them that way. That's actually helped us kind of refine our theory of evolution and help us learn more about it. It didn't necessarily change the whole idea behind evolution, but we changed our theory to match this new data. Now, the other part is a law. Now, laws are pretty rare in science, especially in a science that's not, say, physics or something, especially in our grounded, our earth science, our biology. Stuff is, there's a ton of variables happening, and it's very hard to come up with a universal law that is always true. But some do exist. Gravity is kind of the biggest one. I mean, no matter where you go in the world, really no matter where you go in the universe, gravity acts the same way. You can't break any of those laws, and they're pretty much set in stone. So whether it's a theory or a law, the way that we get there is through multiple iterations of the scientific method. So rolling it all together, that's kind of our end product of the method, is to get to a theory or a law, a way to explain the phenomena that we see in the world, which is pretty fun. So that should be the end of your worksheet. The last slide has a bunch of links on it. These are 2 videos which are going to give you examples of people going step by step through the scientific method or explaining it in a different way than I did. Please let me know if any of these links are broken, and take advantage of these. You can watch them, you can take notes on them. You don't have to take notes on them, but make sure you go through enough of these that you have a pretty good understanding of how the scientific method works and what's going on, especially as you get into kind of the practical problems, the experimental design practice, where you're picking out, what's the independent variable, what's the dependent variable, and so on. If you're getting stuck on those, this could be a resource to come back to. So good luck with all of that, and I will talk to you guys again in our next set of notes.